Hello, my name is Professor Jonathan Passmore. I'm the Senior Vice President of Coaching at CoachHub, the leading global digital coaching provider. And in this session, I'm going to be focusing on making the most of feedback, how digital coaching can help you to grow. During this presentation, I'm going to be talking about what do we mean by feedback? Secondly, I'm going to have a look at the value that feedback can play for us and drawing a little bit about personal experience and some stories, as well as blending that with some research insights. Thirdly, I'm going to be talking about how digital coaching can maximize the benefit and value of feedback to us and our employees. And then, of course, there's always an opportunity for you to raise any questions and reach out to me on LinkedIn for me to have a conversation with you, and as part of this wider event, engage in a discussion how we turn ideas into practice in our organizations. So let's start by having a look at what do we mean by feedback. Of course, this term is used ubiquitously across organizations. We hear the importance of feedback. People talk about it constantly. But what do we mean when we talk about this? And as any researcher, any academic, any writer needs to start by setting out what do they mean by a use of a specific term. Definitions are really important to clarify that we're talking about the same thing. So David Goldman, he suggests good feedback must be more than just reactions to job performance. Feedback includes providing direction and setting goals and objectives for employees. Now, no doubt if you Google feedback, you'll get a variety of different definitions from the practice to the research. At CoachHub, we've reviewed that literature to come to a view about what we believe feedback is in useful organizational conversations. So for us at CoachHub, feedback is regular, constructive, evidence-based information that helps individuals to reflect on their behavior, with the purpose of helping them to understand its impact and to provide opportunities for change. So here you can see a variety of components that bring together what we in our conversations at CoachHub think is particularly important. Feedback is something that we're doing on a regular basis. It's not one-off, it's not a missile out of the blue. It's focused on being constructive, so helping the individual to move forward. It's not about punishing. It's drawing evidence. So we're not biased. We're not driven by our emotion. We're looking for pieces of evidence to inform the individual. And we're looking at the evidence to help them to reflect. So there's the learning cycle being brought in there on their behavior, because that's the only evidence that we see. We don't know what happens in the black box of the mind, but we can certainly see the black box of the mind and maybe emotion played out through individuals' behavior. And it's behavior that we can make judgments about, that we can draw on evidence to help that individual to reflect. And the purpose, the objective of us engaging in this feedback is helping the individual to understand its impact. Sometimes its impact on others, in their customers, on colleagues, on their wider system, and then to provide an opportunity for change. So that reflection leads to insight and action that enables the individual to move on. Now, of course, feedback is not performance appraisal. Maybe that's pretty obvious to all of us who are on this call, but sometimes there is a confusion between the two, that people blur the boundary between feedback and between performance management. Really, appraisals are more of that periodic and planned. They are judging an individual. There's you're falling into this category, or we're rating you or scoring you. There's an evaluative aspect to this. And they're often looking in the rear view mirror to assess, to judge what's happened in the past. And sometimes in many organizations, we might be using them as a mechanism for pay, for other forms of reward. And occasionally we might be using them as forms of punishment. We might be managing people through that appraisal process. A performance management is a way to observe an individual whose performance may be not up to the mark. And as a result, We sometimes will provide them with written evidence to demonstrate that we've had that conversation, we're specifying what needs to change, and if it doesn't, that might lead to a termination of that individual's performance. Now, not surprisingly, performance appraisal has a role in organizations, but it's a different role to feedback. And there is certainly a drive from organizations to question, well, is feedback really helpful to us? Are performance appraisals really useful for us? And Deloitte here are highlighting that movement that maybe the performance appraisal, that periodic, maybe once a year process, which is about judging individuals, may be less helpful than having a more frequent, more constructive conversation with individuals, as the average performers with the good performers and with our elite high performers who are doing incredibly well. But all of us can always reflect, can always learn, can always change and get better. And in this, a feedback process can help individuals in having that reflective piece of evidence to build subsequent improvements and performance. So not confusing the two, focusing instead, yes, sometimes using performance appraisal, but regularly using feedback to be part of the way that we encourage leaders and managers in our organizations to use this as a way of supporting and enhancing performance improvement day by day, week by week, month by month. Now, the evidence is that feedback on that constructive, positive, developmental, regular basis leads to a number of gains. It leads to, not surprisingly, improvements in performance, that it overcomes the gap that sometimes builds up between how other people perceive how an individual's performing and how they themselves make a judgment about their performance. In other words, we help that individual to move closer to the reality of what's going on as assessed by those in their wider system. And it provides opportunities for individuals to gather that information, to reflect and to learn, and then to adjust their behavior that makes those incremental improvements in performance. Elite athletes use this. They're using data, they're using feedback as a way of driving their performance. None of those individuals who are elite athletes wants to stay still. You might be the Olympic champion, you might be the very best tennis player, but unless you continue to improve, unless you get feedback on what you're doing and what you could do better, there is no opportunity for change, no opportunity for growth. Secondly, it allows an improvement, a development of relationships, closing that gap, as I was referring earlier, between how others perceive us and how we perceive ourselves, and opportunities for discussion to explore and also to reflect, and enabling that change process to happen. And through those conversations, through those supportive developmental conversations, relationships strengthen. And thirdly, it supports an individual's overall growth and development. It encourages a culture in organizations where people are looking to continually improve. They're inviting feedback from others because they're hungry, because they're motivated, because they're keen, and see development as part of the way that we do things around here. It's part of the culture of growing, developing, improving. And feedback is a key component of that process, a key component of growth, of development. So the benefits of feedback are clear. Organizations should be doing that if they want growth, they want relationships, and they want improved performance. And if you're an individual who's connecting into this session thinking, show me the numbers, well, here's some statistics from a survey undertaken by the Clear Company in 2019. 68% of employees feel fulfilled in their jobs when they receive accurate and consistent feedback. So 2/3 of people are crying out for this. 14.9% lower turnover rates when companies implement regular employee feedback. And 69% of employees said they would work harder if they felt their efforts were better recognized. What I call catching people doing it right, because feedback doesn't only need to be about the things that we are not doing, the gaps in our performance. It can also be about encouraging individuals to do more of the things that they do very well, to play to their strengths. And as a result of playing to their strengths, about understanding what they're doing well, keep on doing this, that if they're doing more of that, will lead to better outcomes overall. So statistical data, qualitative data, showing the benefits and the impact of feedback as part of a regular, ongoing process in organizations. But I don't know about you, my experience is that too many leaders and managers think that feedback looks like this. That feedback is about telling people how it really is, maybe being driven by emotion, those emotions that employees might often experience as being harassment, bullying, rudeness, aggression, inappropriate behaviors that we don't want to see in the workplace, that are driven by emotion of anger. And instead, we need to be moving away from feedback that is in the moment, that's driven by those emotional responses, that create a reaction where people feel as though they're being attacked, where they're feeling bullied, where their colleagues are fracturing the relationships that exist in a team. Now, my own personal experience of this echoes this. Now, I can think back to a time when I had a boss who shared some feedback with me. And he thought this was great feedback. I wrote a report for a board. I was sitting as a member, as an operations director on a board in an organization where there were 6 of us sat on the leadership team in a multi-million-pound turnover organization, running this organization as operations director. I did a report, and the report needed to go to the chief executive before it then went on to the board for review and discussion. And having written this report a few years ago, I got the report back, printed out on a piece of paper with some feedback on it. And the feedback from my boss was very short, very succinct. This is rubbish. Well, it was feedback of a kind, and it wasn't rude, it wasn't bullying, but it was certainly inappropriate. What was inappropriate about it was isolated. I hadn't received feedback on other reports that I'd done. And I might think, well, okay, this is telling me that it doesn't meet the required standard, but it fell short in providing me any evidence about what I needed to do differently in this report, or any elements that my boss had judged to be satisfactory or good. Did I need to throw the report away, delete the whole report to start again? Or were there some sections that I could keep and other sections that needed to be changed? With just that this was rubbish, that this was inadequate, didn't give me any guidance on what I needed to be doing differently. So bad feedback can be driven by emotions, but also bad feedback can sometimes simply lack evidence, situational information, or specifics that help the individual move from where they are to begin to move forward to create or achieve the required standard. So good feedback, in contrast, uses the language that the individual can understand. We need to be able to speak their language, not just in the national language, but I'm talking about terminology, phrases, clarity of communication that helps the individual say, okay, I recognize that I'm here, and what you're asking me to do is to move to this point here. So understanding becomes really important in the clarity of the communication, the clarity of the evidence, the specificity of what's provided to them. Secondly, good feedback highlights the gap between current performance and desired behavior. What is that gap that needs to be closed? And only by having an understanding of this gap will help the individual start to think and engage with, what do I do differently to close the gap, to move closer to what my boss or my colleague or my customer needs? Thirdly, it needs to be evidence-based. And for me, that means it needs to be specific, and it also needs to be specific to a situation or a moment or example, a specific report. a specific presentation, a specific instant where we have observed the individual ourselves. So not using secondhand information, not using anecdote and story, not using you could do better at writing reports, but using a specific report and providing evidence about what would need to change. In the example that I gave you, when I did question my boss to say, well, what needs to change here? He said, well, what you need to do is to provide a 3-year financial forecast to understand, to help the board understand how the impact of this proposal will run, not just in the current financial year, but next year and the year after. You need to provide that data to help them to think forward. Well, that was really helpful. But I didn't have that in the written feedback that came to me. It needs to be specific. It needs to have that evidence-based to be able to close the gap between the current and the future situation. Feedback also needs to be timely. It needs to be around about the timing of the event. Maybe not in that instant when we're driven by an emotion, when we're frustrated, angry, but instead to step back, to gather our thoughts, to get that evidence together, to identify what the gap is, think about the language about how we're communicating to the individual so they can truly hear and understand what we're saying. And it needs to be also situated that they can remember that incident. So referring back to something that happened last month or 9 months ago, last year, as we're doing that annual review, it's outside of the individual's memory. We need to focus on timely feedback. And last of all, I think it's critical that good feedback is constructive. It's not about doing down an individual. It's not about punishing an individual. It's not about demoralizing and demotivating. It needs to be constructive. It needs to provide ways and pathways for the individual to be able to move forward. And that constructive, timely, evidence-based, closing the gap in a language that understands, with that checklist, we're more likely to deliver good feedback that makes a difference to individuals. A simple checklist that leaders and managers could use each and every day to improve the quality of their feedback conversations. So just an invitation as we're pausing to think about feedback. Not that I'm going to ask you to email me with your answers or to send me those on LinkedIn, although it's always lovely to hear from you. Just think back in your own experience. With that checklist, when was the last time that you received high quality feedback that met those criteria from your own manager? Was that last week, last month, last quarter, last year? Maybe never. But also think about your own performance. When was the last time that you provided high quality feedback that met those 5 tests to a colleague, maybe somebody in your team, maybe a colleague in another team that's constructed to help them improve their performance? Did you do that yesterday, last week, last month? Or was it even further back than that, last quarter, last year, or maybe never? So as you reflect on that and you think about the next opportunity that you're going to be having to provide great feedback, think about those criteria as a heuristic, as a guide to help improve the quality of the feedback that you give others. Now, feedback by itself is not the only action that's needed to lead to a behavior change. As a psychologist who's fascinated by behavior change in the workplace, I know that feedback is just an island and that by itself, it doesn't lead to behavior change. We might have lots of feedback, but it also needs supportive conversations to help us to move forward and develop a consistent new behavior. Now, we can think of many examples, maybe from our personal lives or from situations at work where we, over time, have had pieces of feedback in this job, in our last job, where colleagues have invited us to think about our behavior that have included those criteria, but we haven't made a change. And why is that? We know the information, we know what needs to change, but you and I also know that behavior change is difficult. Because if we had all of that information, if over our working lives, we were able to act on that information, well, wouldn't that be easy? And the reality is behavior change is hard. Look at your diet. Look at your fitness levels. Look at many aspects of your life. Well, actually, I probably should do more exercise. I probably should eat less saturated fats, less shorts, less sugar, and have a healthier diet. And the reality is, of course, we know that information, but making that behavior change stick is really hard. That change for us as human beings, even when we know what we should do, is difficult. This is where coaching comes in. Coaching acts as a source to help us move forward in these supportive conversations to deliver new behaviors in a more consistent way. So what is coaching? Well, not surprisingly, at CoachHub, we have a definition. Coaching involves partnering with clients to help them reflect on themselves, their situation and their context, and identify new insights and actions to unlock potential, enhance well-being, and improve performance. So what we're suggesting here in our definition, it's two people coming together as equals in a relationship. It's focused on the client to help that individual to reflect. Remember that definition from earlier? It's about insight, and it's insight about ourselves, but also it recognizes in a coaching conversation that we're not an island. We are connected to others in our team, in our department, in our organization, and that our behaviors are situational, they're context dependent. And who we are as an individual, our identity, our gender, our race, our national and cultural context will all impact on those aspects. So thinking and understanding about ourselves is critical, but it's not the only element. What we then need to do is, having identified a new insight and action, we need to, through that coaching conversation, help the individual to move forward, to unlock that potential, to enable them to cope better in their well-being and to address any performance deficits or gaps that are there, or enable them to move higher and further in their performance. So how can coaching do this? How can coaching help us with the feedback that we might be receiving? Well, first of all, I think coaching can help us through providing opportunities to receive feedback, sometimes through a 360 report. And there are many great 360 reports that are out there. At CoachHub, we would advocate ones which are psychometrically validated. In other words, there's been other research to show that there is a direct relationship between the behaviors that are measured in that competency framework, in that 360 questionnaire, and improvements in leadership performance. So when you're evaluating a 360 questionnaire, always useful to ask the test provider, ask the psychologist or coach who's working with you, what's the evidence that shows improvements in these behaviors lead to improvements in performance? And don't always take the person's claim for it, because an individual might claim many things. Just as you might do when you go and see a doctor, you'd expect an independent, a peer-reviewed publication or report that shows that others have assessed the tool, not just the person who's written it. So psychometric 360s are immensely valuable, and a number of those are able to, throughout improved scores, demonstrate that leads to improved leadership impact. And a coaching conversation provides an opportunity to receive the feedback, and then secondly, to reflect on that feedback, to have a coach sitting alongside you, inviting you and encouraging you to reflect. What could you do differently to increase the scores? To focus on the gaps between your rating and maybe your manager's rating, or your peers' rating, or your customer's rating. And through that reflection process, to identify new insights for action. What words stand out? What pieces of feedback are particularly critical for you in your specific role? But there's not only 360 feedback that can be helpful. It can be also evidence that you gather anecdotally. So inviting you to engage with key stakeholders and inviting them to share with you their anecdotal feedback. What one thing could they provide you as a piece of advice that you could do differently, that in your relationship with them would make the biggest difference? Biggest difference on your performance, biggest difference in your relationship, biggest difference in how you are impacting with their team or their system. And through these insights, we can then start to turn and develop new actions. Only by knowledge and that feedback that we're getting, 360 report or feedback that we've received anecdotally, can we then develop an action plan. And those action plans are the starting point of a change journey. Having a plan, and I often, at the beginning of a new year, think, Jonathan, it's time this year to truly get yourself fit, truly commit yourself to running a 10K by the time that you get to summer, to making sure that you are really getting fitter and fitter week by week. And like many people, I will often join a gym in that January thinking, hey, Jonathan, keep going, lose a little bit of weight, improve your fitness, do the weights, do the running machine, get on the rowing machine, be fantastic. And I make that plan. But the challenge is being consistent in carrying it out. I might start with that plan in January. I might go for a few weeks. But like many other people, by the time I get to February, I find, oh, it's a rainy night, it's a cold night, it's a snowy night. Maybe I won't go out this evening. Maybe I'm going to watch the ball game that's on television. Maybe I'll stay in and just have a glass of wine or a nice meal with my partner. And so those aspirations, those desires, those dreams that we have are not followed through. This is again where coaching comes in. It's about helping that individual to be a champion for them, to hold them to account, to encourage them to build a support and challenge network, and a team who are going to be there alongside them, helping them to think about the goal that they've set, actionable first steps, and then others who will come in to say, hey, Jonathan, you said you were going to go to the gym on a Tuesday night. It's getting to 7 o'clock. I can have dinner when you're ready at 8. If you come home, I'll pop that into the oven and you go and do 45 minutes at the gym, come back, we can have dinner then. That reminder from a partner or a family member or a friend can help us to make progress. Coaching encourages us to think about those elements, and also in a coaching conversation, the coach will gently hold our feet over the fire to encourage us to reflect on the progress that we're making. And not only setting a great big goal of running a 10K, but thinking about the intermediate steps that enables us to move forward. Well, you might be sitting there thinking, why a digital coaching intervention? Well, I think there's a wide range of benefits of using digital over face-to-face. And I've been coaching for more than 20 years, meeting leaders and managers in many environments, in the public sector, in government organizations, in not-for-profits, as well as in commercial, large and small businesses. And in those conversations, I know the benefits of using online have made me enabled to meet more people and to enable a frequency of those meetings. But other benefits of coaching are quite clear to customers. It allows people, as the client, as the coachee, to be able to also access digital coaching tools, maybe a 360 tool to complete that, gather information that we can then use in the coaching conversation, and do that at the lowest possible cost, at the easiest convenience to them. Digital coaching online conversations are also super easy to access, so reduces the cost and the inconvenience of travel. And that in combination enables CoachHub as a digital provider to democratize coaching by reducing its cost and enabling it to move from the many, the elite as chief executives and senior leaders in organizations deep through the organization to all career grades, giving them the opportunity to benefit from coaching conversations, helping them to improve their performance and ultimately contributing towards the overall business performance. Because coaching is not just about well-being and protecting those aspects of looking after the individual, but it's thinking about well-being and protecting the individual with a purpose, with a focus on driving performance in the workplace. So at CoachHub, our mission is to democratize coaching, to unleash the full potential of your people and to drive the transformation of your business. I've been Jonathan Passmore. Thank you for listening. Please do connect to me on LinkedIn.